Much ado has been said about God of War by me, which is only natural. Great games and game franchises deserve plenty of lip service if you ask me. And as a self-proclaimed fanboy of God of War, I definitely have plenty to say, but in the interest of balance, you have to take the good with the bad, so why not examine both ends of the spectrum at the same time? So this is my personal best and worst things about every God of War game. Let's get started. Alright, the game that started it all. What do I think is the absolute best aspect of God of War 2005? Well, if I had to narrow it down to my absolute favorite element, I would say it's down to a few things. The ending for a start, but YouTube won't let me show that, or that moment where you have to fight all the clones of Kratos while saving Lysandra and Calliope is a very strong moment for the story and characters, but if I had to give flowers to any one specific aspect of the game, the level design would be my pick. Particularly that of Pandora's Temple. I mean, it's so good I made an entire video about it, but to give the Cliff's Notes version of it, Pandora's Temple creates a series of intimately memorable environments that sprawl out and fold back into themselves in such a way that despite being entirely linear, it feels so organically designed, and I just love the way it's always able to return back to the center of the temple, which is almost like a sanctuary from all the craziness that you're subjected to as you go through the level, and the way it's able to tie everything back together in ways you wouldn't expect is such a genius bit of design, and the scale of Pandora's Temple is so massive and so labyrinthine that it lets you feel the true size of what you're dealing with, and the way they're able to tell the story of the architect of the temple as you go through is great, because as he goes along, he starts to lose track of his sanity, leading to more and more elaborately, insanely designed puzzles and death traps. The lower half of Pandora's Temple genuinely has some of the best level design I've ever experienced in a game, and I know some people find that level design to be obnoxious, but to me it makes the experience. Plus, the upper half of Pandora's Temple is nothing to sneeze at either. This is an absolutely sublime bit of design in my opinion. Now, if you want the worst aspect of God of War 2005, there are a few things you can look at, like how there's no quick way to descend walls, or how you can't turn Rage of the Gods mode off and then on again. But those are just little bits of polish that have only been made clear with hindsight. When it comes to things that were never good, to me there was only ever one thing to take the cake, so look no further than the Hades level. Crucified Christ on a croissant. Every time I replay this game, I always enjoy it, but that comes with the asterisk that right before the grand finale of the game, I have to put up with this crap. A level with absolute cornea, searing visual design, and level design that's basically just a series of 100 different bone platforms linked occasionally by spinning logs of flesh and blades. There's no cohesion, all it is a series of gameplay elements put together solely to make a level primarily built around platforming, and not even good platforming. Then to top it all off, spinning cylinders that you have to climb not once, but twice. This right here, I have to give these towers their due. I have no idea what the hell they were thinking by including these. You basically just have to memorize which point is the best point in which to go up, which you can do, but the process of which takes way longer than it needs to. And every time you make the slightest mistake, you have to go all the way back to the bottom, where you have to redo every bit of the cylinder that you just did. This entire level was a mistake, and the sad fact is, a Hades component in a God of War game has all the potential in the world, as we saw with God of War 3, but the way it's envisioned in this game is an entirely poorly thought out mess on every single level. And it's not like it gets better from here necessarily. The final boss is pretty good, but this is the last full level, and while it's only like half an hour if you're good at it, after this it's just a couple of fights followed by the final boss. So it's not like there's one bad part and then the rest of the game is good. This is the end. Definitely not something that I revel in the idea of replaying, but to be clear, I still really enjoy this game as a whole. Best thing about God of War 2? Oh, that's easy. The Sisters of Fate boss fight. The penultimate fight taking place right before you go back in time to face Zeus. Which is not to say that the Zeus boss fight is bad, but the fight with the Sisters of Fate, and more specifically Lachesis and Atropos, is next level. The first part of the fight with Lachesis is a basic but well-designed boss fight with escalating attacks and a heavy emphasis on parrying. I have to pick my clips carefully though, because Lachesis has a boobie out, and I'm already walking on thin ice covering God of War generally. Then from there, you're forced back in time and have to fight Atropos during the final fight in God of War 1 on the Blade of the Gods. So she's trying to destroy the Blade of the Gods, thereby altering history to have Kratos die during the fight with Ares. So you have to fight her, a bunch of minor enemies, as well as prevent her from damaging the sword too heavily. There's a lot going on here, and it's extremely tense. Definitely this game's version of the Attack of the Clones from the first game. Then from there, you fight both Sisters of Fate at the same time while contending with new attacks. Atropos is stuck halfway in a mirror reflecting the past, so you have to use your abilities to destroy the mirrors and then finally send both of those sisters through the third and final mirror, sending them both straight to hell, or wherever the gods go when they die. This is such a peak boss fight. It builds perfectly, it follows the rule of threes to perfection, it's varied, it utilizes the game's unique mechanics, it's compellingly difficult, and they're able to mix things up better than most boss fights given that you have two different people you're fighting that each have distinct abilities. I would argue this is the best fight in the history of God of War. It is essentially a perfect fight in every way. Can't say one bad thing about it. So, the worst thing about God of War 2? Well, if I'm being honest, I think it comes down to the fact that most of the game is, well, filler. Now, I don't mean that in a derogatory way, because it's really good filler. I really enjoy playing this game, but after the intro, the entire plot is basically finding the Sisters of Fate, and everything you do in between the 2 points is so much filler. I mean, theoretically, if the Pegasus that Kratos flew on could have lasted long enough, he probably could have flown all the way to the Great Chasm at least. Because at that point, you have puzzles relevant to opening the way to the Temple of the Fates. Before that, though, is there really much about this game as far as level design that Kratos couldn't have hypothetically just skipped over? Well, I don't know the exact answer to that, but if my hunch is correct, yeah, he probably could have skipped most of it. But it is a double-edged sword because the core of the experience is just that good, so I'm willing to put up with the gameplay for gameplay's sake so long as they don't go overboard. And I don't think they went overboard in this case. Well, this is my first time talking about God of War Betrayal, and knowing my track record probably won't be the last. If I had to pick the best thing about it, it's probably the fact that it exists at all. I mean, this is a simple little Java mobile game that was supposed to run on flip phones back in the day, both low-end and high-end. Integrating code so it could be played on 100 different varieties of phone, that was no small feat. So the fact that they were working on such harsh limitations and managed to make something that ended up being halfway decent is worth celebrating in itself. It's definitely a game that held up on its novelty, and removed from that novelty it's nothing special, so it really hasn't aged all that well, but you gotta appreciate the amount of hard work and skill that was required with this game, even if you don't necessarily like it as a game. But honestly, I think the worst thing about it, as implied in the last bit, is simply the fact that it really doesn't hold up well outside of its original intention. There are games that are able to subvert their limitations and be good in their own right, like how Grand Theft Auto Vice City Stories held up beyond being a GTA game you could play on the go, but this is one of those games that's so vapid and so tied to the limitations of the systems you played it on that it's really not worth playing outside of the novelty of itself. It really just doesn't hold up. As far as best parts of Chains of Olympus, there are a few things I could have put here, but there is one thing in this game that sticks out in my mind more than any, so you have to give it to this moment. The moment where Kratos is finally reunited with Calliope, but has to push her away in order to go save the world. It's such a beautiful moment of interactive storytelling where you have to mash the circle button in order to gently push Calliope away. But if Kratos doesn't stop Persephone, she'll destroy all of existence. So Kratos either abandons Calliope or he lets her perish once more. It's such a heart-wrenching moment. One that you would never really expect in a game as supplementary as God of War Chains of Olympus. And I can't stress enough, the way they integrate the gameplay in order to tell the story visually is genius. How the same amount of strength that it would normally take to kill a Minotaur is only a fraction of the amount of strength that it takes Kratos to give up everything he fought so hard to achieve. Genuinely, this moment is sublime, though I will give the runner-up position to the Gauntlet of Zeus because that thing packs an absolute wallop. As far as unique weapons go, that's the best one in the game. I could bash enemy skulls in for days. As for worst aspect of Chains of Olympus, well, it's kinda caught between two things for me. First of which being, this game is essentially entirely inconsequential other than for world building because it's a prequel to the entire main series which was already in progress. So everything has to go back to status quo in the end, with the only consequential aspects being that Kratos killing Persephone is brought up in God of War 3, and Atlas was still salty for you trapping him when you find him in God of War 2, neither of which is required reading. So you can skip this game and not really miss anything of note, but I feel like that's not really a fair criticism considering that this was never really meant to be earth-shattering. They knew they couldn't hope to make anything that affected a universe already in motion, so they could only hope to make a fun game, which they did. So that means the worst thing has to go to the Light of Dawn. God of War has always struggled to make ranged weapons worth a damn. Usually the best ranged weapons are the ones that are actually close-ranged melee weapons that just happen to have far-ranged attacks, because if you're attacking something from afar, of course you have to balance it out by making the weapon not as powerful. And I feel like a lot of God of War ranged weapons don't really work outside of their contextual elements, but the Light of Dawn takes the cake as far as pure uselessness in ranged weapons. It's unbearably slow to use and takes several shots to take out even the most basic enemies. You'd think that far-away archers would only go down after a few shots from the Light of Dawn or any ranged weapon, because generally the only way to attack far-away archers is to shoot them with a ranged weapon. But the Light of Dawn would beg to differ, taking several shots to take down a single far-away enemy. Easily one of the worst weapons ever envisioned by the series. It's the type of thing that you use for the contextual purposes and essentially nothing else. Even upgraded, it's not much better, and even then the charge attack takes way too long to charge. Yeah, this is just not good. Oh man, how do I pick a single aspect of God of War 3 to highlight? Because to me, God of War 3 is basically the closest to the series gets to absolute perfection. But I guess, gun to my head, I would have to say the best thing about God of War 3 is the combat engine, and specifically the weapon variety, and more specifically the 4 main weapons. You're given the Blades of Exile, an enhanced version of the Blades of Chaos and Athena respectively, the Claws of Hades, which are faster and have more explosive attacks at the expense of a bit of damage, and are a nonetheless fun to use set of blades you get from Hades. Then you have the Nemean Cestus, a pair of gauntlets you get from Hercules, which are just so satisfying to use. Pure crunchy perfection. Even the final of these 4 weapons, the Nemesis Whip, only takes the wooden spoon to me because the other 3 are so good. But even then, the way you're able to stall combos is very creative, and if you're able to integrate that into your playstyle, no doubt it's really useful. I find this set of weapons, despite being 3 chain blades and a pair of gauntlets, to each be distinct in how they're used, especially the magic attacks, and shout out to the soul summon attack with the Claws of Hades, in which you can pick from a number of souls to attack with. All this combined makes for what is easily the best combat engine in the entire history of this series. I know it's a bit broad to just place the entire combat engine as the best thing, but what can I say? When you're dealing with a game as good as God of War 3, it's hard to pick one specific thing to stand above all else. As far as worst aspects of God of War 3, I think there's one particular section of that game that completely and utterly baffles everyone when they play it. And no, I'm not talking about the Space Harrier minigame, that probably comes in at a distant second at best. The universal lowlight of God of War 3 is definitely that weird, out-of-place rhythm game that I somehow always forget about. Like, I don't think anybody would argue this, and I think it should be pretty self-explanatory. Like, what were they thinking? It's not particularly hard, in fact, you may fail once or twice on your first playthrough, and after that it gets pretty easy, but at that point it just becomes a baffling obligation that they put you through on every single playthrough. And easy as it is, you gotta wonder what the point is, why they decided to add this superfluous game mode for this one moment. And on a side note, you gotta love how these symbols are the actual buttons and not some sort of representative symbol that would have fit in-universe, which is kind of funny, but at the same time definitely breaks the consistency. It's one of a small handful of blemishes in a game that is otherwise a perfect 10. As for Ghost of Sparta, I absolutely love how Kratos' heritage as a Spartan is so integrated into the game. Which makes sense, given the title of the game. In a lot of this series, Kratos' heritage is kind of an incidental aspect of his character because it's not relevant to his present, only relevant to his past, and even then it's only relevant to the part of his past before he turned on Ares. And otherwise, he could have been from near enough anywhere, and the story probably would have still worked, although the Ghost of Argus doesn't have quite as good of a ring to it. But here, the name Ghost of Sparta does really carry a lot of weight. You see several flashbacks to his upbringing, which helps flesh out his childhood and his familial relationships and how that impacts him in the present day. You visit Sparta at one point where he's welcomed back as a hero and as a legend, and they even give you Kratos' shield and spear to use as a weapon, which is one of the better weapons in the series, with plenty of varied attacks, a ranged component, and a satisfying feel. But more importantly, it's the weapon he used, the very weapon he used, as a general of the Spartan army. Truly, the Sparta and Ghost of Sparta casts a wide net over the game, but it's also what makes the game. But if I gotta be honest, there's an aspect of Ghost of Sparta that I really don't like. Quite frankly, I hate the amount of enemies that can grapple you. They can grapple you mid-animation and with no way to block. They can break through pretty much every line of defense you put up and are guaranteed to deal damage if they grab you, and are also guaranteed to force you to button mash for a minute. And this is in practically every single fight. There are a couple of notable enemies that are particular pains in my ass, but most of all, Kara's Wraith. These are the undead minions of Thanatos, and they just pop out of the ground and will grapple you into these nearly unavoidable animations, and these things show up way too often, and when it's not them, it might be Cyclopses or any number of different enemies. They went grapple crazy in this game to the point that on my first playthrough, that was really the only thing I remembered about the game. Just how obnoxious the fights could get because of this single aspect. Which is a shame because it's a single blemish on what is otherwise one of the best combat engines that God of War ever put out. And it's a pretty significant blemish, although I would definitely say the runner-up for worst part of Ghost of Sparta is the fact that it came out after God of War 3, but was intended to set up the events of God of War 2 and 3, so there's way too much hand-waving. Thanatos infers that they picked the wrong brother when they kidnapped Deimos. Thera talks about how Kratos is destined to free the Titans. Poseidon talks about how Kratos is gonna pay for what he did to Atlantis. The Gravedigger says there's 2 down and 1 to go, and the entire plot is based around the gods trying to prevent a prophecy that will spell the end of the Olympians. A prophecy that I don't think was ever mentioned up to this point. It just seems like they're trying to retroactively give meaning to something that really didn't need any. Kratos had enough against the Olympians that he didn't need a prophecy to justify destroying Olympus. But as annoying as it is, this still ends up being a relative nitpick to me, because I find this to be one of the better stories in the history of God of War by and large. So yeah, the grappling enemies definitely takes the cake for me. The best thing about God of War Ascension? God, that's like trying to find the best thing about my boss. I mean, I like his Scottish accent. Well, if I have to give God of War Ascension its flowers, I know some people have really praised the multiplayer mode in the past, but I never played it. So as it sits in my experience right now, I think this might actually be the best presented PS3 game of all time. It is absolutely stunning the things they were able to do on 256 megabytes of RAM. You could tell me this was an early 8th gen game and I would believe you. The graphics and effects are so beyond what you think the PS3 would be capable of. The details and visual effects are on point, the scale is absolutely ridiculous with some of the most beautiful panoramic shots a fixed camera could provide. And with so many beautiful environments, it's hard not to have your jaw drop. But I think the best showcase of the production value is definitely the Amulet of Ouroboros. The way the PS3 is able to deconstruct and reconstruct these environments seamlessly is absolutely stunning. You know, I've had a couple of people tell me that God of War Ascension basically refused to work on their PS3s, like they'd get to the main menu and the game would crash, and honestly, that happened to me a few times when I tried to replay the game. I popped it in and it just wouldn't work. It would work after a couple of tries, but one would assume this game pushes the hardware so far that it barely even functions, and yet I never really noticed any performance issues. So honestly, this game is a technical masterpiece, so if there's one good thing I can say about God of War Ascension, it's that. Now, as for worst aspect of Ascension, I was gonna give it to the gameplay as a whole, because God of War Ascension really tries to fix what isn't broken, and ironically ends up breaking it. And as much as the gameplay is easily the worst in the series, I don't want to be too broad, but even then it's pretty tough, like how they completely uprooted the Rage of the God system from previous games and ruined it. But if I had to narrow down the worst thing about God of War Ascension, I have to give it to the Trial of Archimedes. This is a sequence of battles towards the end of the game that comes one after another with no break in between. The first time I played this game, it took me 6 tries to get through, and it is not a short sequence whatsoever. If you die towards the end, that's like 10 minutes of gameplay gone right there. As a matter of fact, most people I've talked to will agree that this is a really weird bottleneck that they decided to put right at the end of the game, and as a matter of fact, actually used to be harder because certain enemies drop a small amount of health which helps you through, but apparently back in the day during the 1.0 version, there was no health refill. You did it all in one go, or you give up and turn off the game. So Santa Monica had to acquiesce and make it easier. Easier, not easy. It's still a pretty agonizing sequence of battles that I do not relish the idea of playing again. As a matter of fact, at this point I don't ever see myself playing Ascension again. I know it's pretty cliched to rag on Ascension, but what can I say? Sometimes even my opinion can align with the popular consensus. I'm being ironic, by the way. I'm poking fun at the people who think I'm a contrarian. When it comes to the best part of God of War 2018, look no further than this moment.
There's nowhere you can hide, Spartan. Put as much distance between you and the truth as you want. It changes nothing. Pretend to be everything you are not. Teacher, husband, father. But there is one unavoidable truth you will never escape. You cannot change. You will always be a monster.
I can't even describe just how awesome this moment is if you don't have the proper context. These are the most iconic weapons in the series, the ones that Kratos had seared into his skin when he pledged himself to Ares. The Blades of Chaos. And now he has to break them out one more time. He has to relive his curse that he spent so many years running from. The game does a good job at pretending like it wants nothing to do with the old games, to the point that some people will tell you that Santa Monica is ashamed of its past, but I think that the lack of acknowledgement of the past for the first half of the game was a deliberate ploy in order to lead you on. Only for this moment to happen, and they acknowledge the past, and that makes it all the more awesome. I've used this comparison before, but it bears repeating. Kratos breaking out the Blades of Chaos in his time of need is the God of War equivalent of that one moment where Captain America picks up Mjolnir. I can't speak on this moment from an objective point of view, given the fact that I've been with this franchise for so many years, so I don't know how it plays to a new player who picked this game up because it was the big PlayStation exclusive at the time, but for me, it's probably the best way the game could ever possibly reward longtime players. It is essentially the perfect moment, and it wouldn't have worked half as well had they not made you think they didn't care. As for the worst aspect of 2018, that's actually a hard one because I can't really think of anything this game does badly. There's certainly some things that are underdeveloped or don't reach their full potential, but nothing that I would call a straight up lowlight. I guess if you held a gun to my head and asked me, well, I'd say this is like the third time you've held a gun to my head, but I'd say there's a bit of a repetition issue with this game where you find yourself fighting the same or similar mini-bosses several times throughout the game, and even the overall enemy variety is lacking. I mean, I love the gameplay, so I'm not going to sit here and say that this is a ruinous aspect, nor am I one of those people who claim it's not God of War unless you're killing gods every 5 seconds, but it's definitely noticeable on repeat playthroughs just how many times some enemies and enemy archetypes show up. God of War Ragnarok is another one that I struggle to hone in on exactly one thing that stands out more than any other, because this is a really solid game. But if I had to narrow it down to one thing, I think I would probably go with Kratos as a character overall, because this is probably my favorite portrayal of him, and that includes God of War 3, which I also adore. But I think the fact is, Kratos in God of War 3 and Kratos in Ragnarok are essentially interlinked, because while he eventually learned to accept the monster he used to be in God of War 3, that still doesn't mean the person he used to be is gone. He merely has control, and there's such a compelling through line in Ragnarok of Kratos constantly being at odds with himself, fighting this war within himself to stop the old ghost of Sparta from coming out. Duality is a key theme with this game, and Kratos is a prime example of that, wanting to keep the monster inside himself chained, but the world conspires to bring it out. One of the best moments in the game was when Heimdall left Kratos no choice but to kill him, and Kratos realized what he had allowed himself to do and was afraid for what might happen next. But in the end, he's forced to be the ghost of Sparta he once was, to finally stop holding back. Then it's Atreus who, weeping for the innocent, makes Kratos decide to choose his humanity over the monstrosity even if it kills him. Then there are his struggles with being the father that Atreus deserves, preparing Atreus to be alone because Kratos saw a mural depicting his own death. Then you have his continuing insecurities over the god he once was and his desire to be a better god, which is paid off in the most satisfying way possible. As a matter of fact, all of this is paid off in the most satisfying way possible. The writing is so dense in this game, and that's dense in a good way. Not every aspect of this game was a home run, but as far as Kratos, they did right by him, and I refuse to let anybody tell me otherwise. The worst aspect of God of War Ragnarok, though, unlike 2018, is piss easy to come up with. In fact, it's probably the easiest thing on this entire list to come up with. This might be recency bias, as the game is still fairly new and therefore still fairly fresh in my mind. I could have put the grand finale as the worst aspect, but I don't think the grand finale is so bad as much as it's just underwhelming. Not reaching expectations isn't the same as being bad or boring, so the absolute worst part of God of War Ragnarok was definitely the Ironwood. This entire segment, pardon my French, is the drizzling shits. But with that said, I can kinda see what they were going for here. The entire game had been go 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 up until now, with a lot of action, and they wanted to give you a break in order to soak in the characters a bit more, as well as introduce a love interest for Atreus. So Atreus warps to a region of Jotunheim called the Ironwood for an hour of gameplay, and it may only be 1 hour, upwards of 2 if you're really terrible, but it's so slow paced. I think that the assertion that all first-party PlayStation games are walking simulators is absolute crap, and to that point, people will complain about the story segments in games like The Last of Us, but never had anything to say about the exact same slow-paced story segments from Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, because to some people, games starring non-human characters just get a free pass. But in this case, I can kind of agree with the whole walking simulator thing. You're just riding around on a yak, picking fruit, skipping stones, running, occasionally getting into combat. Please God, make it end. It also didn't help that I really wasn't digging Agrabota at first. She just came across to me as sort of a manic pixie dream girl, but she did eventually grow on me. However, not during this segment. If I could skip the entire Ironwood segment on return playthroughs, I would do so happily, because this just sucks. Well, these have been my picks for the best and worst parts of every God of War game. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know in the comment section, and don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. And if you want to support the channel in a more direct fashion, you can pledge to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards like early access, Discord benefits, and exclusive content, along with these fine folks right here. And an extra special thank you to Billy Knott, Brooklyn, Gauze004, Cotton Swab, Kristopher Fulton, Leyabout, MyNameIsTank, Raaf, Twisted Wishes, TyTrovy, and WeirdWebbster for going above and beyond. Elsewise than that, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.